Hello, Tom. Nice to be interviewing you again. I've got something unusual for you, a different kind of a question from Michael, who couldn't make it to the VIP supporters. And he says, thank you for your MBT model. It has certainly changed my perspective on life and being here. When he interviewed his friend Ken Bulmer, now Ken Bulmer is a prolific writer of science fiction and other genres. I asked him about how he could write 3 novels per month at his peak, and what would be some of the history of his characters 20 years later. His answer to both was the same. He was an organic writer. Since he had no computer, just a typewriter and carbons, he would one-off all the stories, literally channeling all of his characters. He was sure they had all full and interesting lives. But due to his paralysis, he couldn't type to retrieve any of it. So Michael started doing the same in his Dungeons and Dragons campaign on the Roll20 online interface, completely unscripting NPCs. He's done this for nearly 5 years now. Some of the storylines and personalities, he says, are mind-blowing. I just had the God of Magic decide that he needed to check out since he was tired of the responsibility of managing how magic was assessed and doled out, and had plateaued on progress. A spot-on LCS scenario on free will, constricting PMR rule sets, big cheese, and reaching an evolutionary dead end. You're the god, you can't leave. Why the heck not? So, is this similar to what you are trying to achieve with the NPCs in Tom's Park?
Well, kind of yes and no. No, in the sense that I don't really define the NPCs in Tom's Park. I let the larger conscious system do that. So it's not my mind that they spring from. Their personalities, who they are, what they do, and so on, is not anything to do with me. They just are who they are. So I just let that up to the larger conscious system to determine their personalities, what they're going to say and do. So when you think about it, that's sort of what we are. We're also pieces of the larger consciousness system, and our little piece of consciousness is part of that larger system. So you might think also that that's kind of the way we are. It's the larger consciousness system working through us to define our personalities and the things that we do. So these characters, these NPCs, are not a lot different than you and I, or Michael for that matter. They're creations of the larger consciousness system, subsets of the larger consciousness system, playing an avatar, playing a character. So we tend to think of them as kind of made-up characters, NPCs. They're not real people. But then maybe we're not real people either. Or maybe they are real people just like us. So I don't make a real strong distinction there.
Okay.
And they will be played by the larger conscious system in a way to give the humans that are playing Tom's Park, that are in Tom's Park, to give them the opportunities to learn. So they will play a character to optimize that person's learning.
Right.
So that same character may act a little differently with different people, but it's all going to be within the framework of that single character. So the LCS will make up characters, present those characters, animate those characters in order to be as helpful as possible. So if there's a person that comes to Tom's Park because they're lonely and they want to have dinner with someone else, he'll pick just the perfect person to help that person deal with their inner problem, whether
Right.
that loneliness comes out of not having a good self-esteem or whether it comes out of something else. They will produce a character that helps them grow up. So that's part of the magic of Tom's Park, is that it's all created and maintained by the larger consciousness system. All I did was give it kind of a bare bones. I defined the bare bones, the rules, things. I gave a lot of things where people could interact, different places, different things. There's 10 or 15 things all just in the lodge, that's there. Besides all the things that's outside. So if you have a conversation with your horse, well, that horse is the larger consciousness system. So that horse can be very wise. That horse can say whatever it is to you that gives you opportunities to learn and grow up and helps you develop your intuitive side. So that's kind of the idea of Tom's Park, is to put people in an environment where they interact with the larger consciousness system.
Yeah.
And that's what it does.
Could you differentiate for the audience how you see NPCs and how you see us, free will awareness units, with avatars?
Well, here in this particular virtual reality that we call the physical universe, it's an easy way to distinguish between those, and that is that you and I, are free will awareness units from some IUOC, individuated unit of consciousness, and we are born here, live here, die here. It's a whole lifetime experience. The NPCs in the same physical universe are put here for a very specific reason, to do something. So I call those cameo roles. They're not born here and live here, whatever. They show up at a very precipitous time in somebody's life and do something that makes a really big difference, and then they disappear. It's that sort of thing. So the NPCs here are characters that the LCS needs to play a very specific part for usually a very specific time.
Sure.
They don't necessarily are going to stay here for years, but they stay here to do the thing that they do. They could stay here for years. It just depends. And then they disappear again. So they're not going, for them, it's not a lifetime experience. It's just a cameo role in their interaction with another person.
You mentioned I let the LCS give them the background. Now, to me, there's a little bit of a similarity with what Ken was doing by imagining that they had a full life and background and letting the story unfold from there. I see a little bit of similarity there. Would you think that that was something similar?
Oh,
If
there's a
you're
lot of
letting,
similarity there, Donna. It's a lot of
yeah,
similarity. A lot of writers get their characters and their stories right out of the LCS. Like you say, it's like they're channeling it. It's not really channeling. They're not talking to an individual consciousness, but they get the story line. They get the characters, and all of that unfolds, and all they have to do is connect, and the story begins to flow. And all they're doing is typing it or writing it or speaking it or something.
Yes.
And it's sure, it's like that. And particularly, it's like that if the story that's created helps people see a larger reality. If it's a kind of story that makes people think, that makes people reconsider, if it's that sort of story, as opposed to just fun and silliness and games and things, then it's probably not as well supported as if it were a story that when people get done, they spend the next couple of weeks after they're done reading the book kind of thinking about the concepts and the things that were going on in the book. So books that are given like that tend to also be books that are valuable to help open people's minds.
Well, in Ken's case, it might be something like entertainment value, as he wrote science fiction novels. So perhaps those characters had a specific purpose to be in a specific role for that reason, more of an entertainment, but also perhaps a little bit more than that too. That's probably the difference between Tom's Park and the way Ken was writing.
If you're writing books, they have to be entertaining. Even a book that has a very serious purpose or the very serious juxtaposition of concepts and ideas that are at its heart, but it has to also be entertaining. If it's not entertaining, people aren't going to read it. People don't read novels because they want to learn philosophy. They read novels to be entertained. But you can entertain people and still give them philosophy. Look at the really big writers like Charles Dickens. Look at his stories. They're not just stories. They're stories that put a juxtaposition between the wealthy and the poor, between good and evil, the same sort of things. But the story has a lot more significance to it just in its entertainment value. It also has a lot of social and personal value in it as well. So, just because it's written with entertainment in mind doesn't mean it's devoid of very meaningful things.
So do you think that Ken's style, creative style of organic writing, letting the character unfold, having
Mm-hmm.
that in mind just flow through, would give that novel some advantage in that it's a little more of a creative process and not a thought out and
Oh,
planned
sure.
sort of thing?
Oh, sure. Whatever the intellect can do, the intuition can do better.
Mm,
You know, that's usually the way it works. No matter
yeah,
what you're doing, whether you're sewing a patch on a hole in a pair of jeans, no matter what you're doing, if you do it entirely from the intellect, it'll be okay, but you'll make mistakes. Things won't quite happen right. You'll miss a stitch, or one stitch will be too long and not quite be where it's supposed to be. But if you do it intuitively, it'll turn out to be as perfect as it can get. Because once you
interesting.
take your intellect out of it, then you stop second guessing, you stop judging,
Mm,
you stop being distracted. Once you're into that intuitive mode, you're not distracted. You are there, you're a part of that, and it's a part of you. So everything works better.
yeah.
Athletes play a better game if they play that game intuitively. If they have to think about
Yes.
what they're doing, they won't be nearly as good or as accurate or make as many baskets or whatever it is they're doing as if they just let it flow through them and get into an
Absolutely.
intuitive sense of the game. So that's just it. Surely, writers who just let it flow. The characters are like live things. They're just, you
Yes.
know, they're just writing down the story. Then
Right.
those are going to be more realistic. People will read that and find more connection to it.
Yeah.
Whereas if your intellect tries to make a story, there's going to be starts and stops and things that don't quite flow evenly.
Sure.
So I think a general rule is that whatever the intellect can do, the intuition can do better.
That's great. And that's
Even
the whole
even when
purpose.
even when it comes to very technical or precise things like the savants that can tell you the cube root of 9,842, and they tell that to you in a second. They don't calculate it. Calculating is a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Cube roots are real difficult to do by hand, or do in your head. They're almost impossible. But these often children, who have probably no math skills, what they do is intuitively they get the answer. And they're not calculating anything. They're simply reading the numbers that appear in their mind in the order that they appear. And it just
Yeah.
happens to be the exact correct answer, to 10 decimal places of the result. So
Yeah.
the intuition can be very powerful once you develop it to that point. And these children, mostly autistic children, and why autistic children? Because their logical side's broken. They have to develop their intuitive side in order to connect with the world.
Mm.
So they do. So for them, that's just the only route that's left to them. So they spend time developing that intuitive side because their intellectual side doesn't work very well. So they get good at it.
Yeah.
Now, you don't have to be autistic to develop your intuitive side.
Yes.
Everybody can develop their intuitive side. And a writer who gets into what you just labeled organic writing, then sure, that's a good way to do it. And the stories that you write will be more fluid, the characters more believable, And the storyline will actually have a thread of meaning and significance to it that's beyond the entertainment.
Interestingly enough, developing intuition is the purpose of Thomas Park, which is why there's
Mm-hmm.
a difference in the NPCs and what their role is. Do you see that developing that intuition is, I think we've talked about this before, we've talked about it within the framework of writers, how helpful it would be for writers to use Thomas Park to pick up that storyline, almost like Michael is describing the way
Mm-hmm.
Ken wrote. He was picking up the storyline from those organic NPCs that he had thought out, so that lifetime could go on for those 20 years, the way he
Mm-hmm.
would imagine it. Um, so that was one of the actual applications of Thomas Park. Writers, musicians, and any kind of creative person who would use their intuition in a more powerful
Mm-hmm.
way, develop it through their imagination, I think is one of the similarities there, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
with what
Yeah, well,
Ken had
Tom's
done.
Park has a lot of value to a lot of people in different ways. It's a way for some people to master paranormal things without ever having to learn how to meditate. It just takes a
Yeah,
different route, so it has that value. It has the value that it's not only an a interactive space, but it's also a social space. So you can go there and interact with the people who are there. And these aren't other people for the most part that are playing in Tom's Park. These are the characters that are in Tom's Park that basically live there. But you can interact with them. And yes, they have full lives, they have histories, they have their own issues, they have likes and dislikes, they have personalities. They're just like us. They're also a subset of the larger consciousness system, but they work in Tom's Park, and that's their thing. We don't. We go incarnate and work here in this physical universe to do things, and they have a different job, but
yeah,
basically they're pieces of the larger conscious system as well. So
yeah.
don't, yeah, it's kind of a wrong idea to think of them as like fake people who aren't
Okay.
real. You know, they're about as real as we are. They just have a different job in a different in a different virtual reality, so to speak,
Yeah.
and that's
And their stories can
that's
unfold. You,
oh, of
in a
course,
sense, in a theory, you have placed the NPCs there, supported by the LCS, and their stories unfold as an organic creative writer would
right,
have his characters
sure,
unfold.
sure, absolutely. But
Yeah,
the difference in these characters in Tom's Park is they're not going to come with their only experience being in Tom's Park. They're going to come with a full experience of their life from birth to the present moment. And they're going to come with all of that experience. Now, did they actually work in some other reality to get that experience? Probably not. They were probably just given that experience to start with. So,
okay.
in any case, that's the story, and the experience that they have is custom fit to match what the Tom's Park user needs.
Right, what the purpose is, of
Yes, what
course.
the purpose is.
It's interesting. Unlike the science fiction writer, where that is its only setting there, that's
Mm-hmm.
the only background it knows. But this was really interesting. And Michael, thank you for submitting that question. I hope you like what Tom had to say about it and how there were some similarities and some differences too. Would you like to see a better world? Get a better perspective. Balance your intellect with intuition and explore your true nature with the Exploring Consciousness and Everything Paranormal program with Thomas Campbell. In this program, you will have the benefit of Tom's vast experience,
and learn to access point consciousness, communicate with the larger consciousness system, remote view, use your natural ability to heal with intent, and explore reality in the out-of-body state. His famous binaural beats are included. Details are in the description below. Thank you.
I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member, because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you.